The air in the room felt heavy, almost tangible, as though it carried the weight of what was about to unfold. She stood there, frozen, her fingers clutching the edge of her silk dress. The dim glow of the bedside lamp flickered slightly, casting elongated shadows on the walls. Her husband, seated casually on the armchair, leaned forward and whispered, "Trust me, you'll thank me for this later." His words were steady, deliberate, a mixture of reassurance and command, but they only deepened the knot in her stomach. Her pulse raced as the sound of a knock echoed through the room. Her eyes darted toward the door, then back to her husband, searching for answers in his calm, almost detached expression. The door creaked open, revealing two tall strangers who walked in with a confidence that both unsettled and intrigued her. They exchanged a quick glance, a silent understanding passing between them, before their gazes landed on her. Her mind spiraled back to a moment weeks ago, when her husband had first floated the idea. They'd been sitting on their terrace, sharing a bottle of wine. He'd leaned in close and said, "What if we tried something different?" She'd laughed it off, assuming it was just one of his many adventurous suggestions that never went beyond conversation. But now, standing in this room, she realized it had been more than idle chatter. He had planned this, meticulously, intentionally, and she hadn't seen it coming. Her breath hitched as one of the men spoke, his voice low and measured. "I'm Marcus, and this is Darnell. We're here to make sure you're comfortable." There was a surprising warmth in his tone, a stark contrast to the intensity of the moment. She nodded faintly, unsure of what to say, her throat dry and her thoughts jumbled. Her husband's voice cut through the silence. "Take your time," he said, his tone maddeningly composed. "This is about you." "About me?" She wanted to scream. Every fibre of her being felt conflicted. How could this possibly be about her when it felt like her agency had been stripped away? Yet there was a part of her, small, quiet, but undeniable, that was curious. She had always prided herself on being open-minded, on trusting her husband. But this was a boundary she hadn't imagined crossing. She looked at the two men again. Their presence was commanding but not aggressive. There was something almost disarming in their steady, respectful demeanour. They didn't rush her, didn't speak beyond their initial introduction. It was as if they understood that this moment wasn't just about physicality. It was about trust, vulnerability, and the unspoken dynamics of her marriage. Her gaze shifted to her husband, who was watching her intently. His eyes, usually so familiar, now held an intensity she couldn't decipher. Was it anticipation, pride, or something else entirely? Memories of their life together flashed before her. The day he proposed, the vows they exchanged, the countless nights they spent talking about their dreams and fears. How had they arrived here, at this crossroads between love and betrayal, trust and coercion? Her chest tightened as a surge of emotions overwhelmed her. Anger at his audacity, fear of the unknown, and a lingering sense of loyalty to the man she had built a life with. She wanted to scream, cry, run, but her feet remained rooted to the floor. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked gently, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, grounding. It was the first time she felt someone in the room acknowledged her turmoil. She nodded, though she wasn't sure if it was for him or herself. "You're in control," her husband added, his voice softer now. "If you don't want this, we stop right here. But if you trust me, trust us. I think this could be something incredible." Trust. The word lingered in her mind like a refrain, echoing louder with each repetition. She had trusted him through so much: career changes, financial struggles, family crises. But this felt different, heavier, as though it was asking for a piece of her she wasn't ready to give. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. She drew a deep breath, trying to find clarity amidst the chaos in her mind. Her heart whispered one thing while her rational mind screamed another. And yet, in the midst of it all, she realized that the choice was hers to make. Her fingers relaxed their grip on her dress, and she exhaled slowly. The weight of the night pressed against her, but there was a strange, flickering sense of resolve forming within her. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for better or worse, she was stepping into it on her terms. The knock on the door was a quiet echo of what was already building inside her, a crescendo of disbelief, anger, and confusion. She stood in stunned silence as the door opened, revealing two men who walked in with a calm confidence that both unsettled and intrigued her. One of them, the taller of the two, spoke first. "I'm Marcus, and this is Darnell," he said, his voice deep yet unexpectedly gentle. "We're here to make sure you're comfortable." Comfortable? The word felt absurd in the moment. Her gaze darted to her husband, who was now casually pouring himself a drink, as if this were just another evening. His nonchalance was maddening, and she felt the sting of betrayal clawing its way up her throat. He caught her glance and offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that was meant to reassure her, but only fanned the flames of her indignation. The room seemed to shrink as her mind raced. The pieces began falling into place, each realization sharpening her emotions. The subtle hints over the past weeks, his cryptic comments about expanding horizons, the mysterious phone calls he ended abruptly, his excitement over trying something new. She had brushed it off as his usual curiosity, his way of keeping their life together fresh. But this felt like a betrayal of trust, a violation of the unspoken boundaries they had built together. Her breath quickened as she fought the urge to lash out. Her anger was a storm, but so was her confusion. Why had he done this? Was this about him? About her? Or about them as a couple? The questions tangled in her mind, making it impossible to focus on anything but the pounding of her heart. The strangers stood silently, their presence both imposing and oddly respectful. They weren't pushing her, weren't speaking beyond their initial introduction. It was as if they understood that this moment wasn't about them. It was about her and the man she had built a life with. The man who now stood across the room, watching her with an intensity she couldn't decipher. A flash of memories surged through her. Their first date, the way he had looked at her when she walked down the aisle, the promises they had made to always respect and honor each other. Those moments felt distant now, like echoes from another life. Yet they were the foundation of everything she held dear. How could he risk that? How could he think this was okay? Her husband set his drink down and walked toward her. "You're in control," he said softly. "If you don't want this, we stop right here. But if you trust me, trust us. This could be something incredible." Trust. The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. It was the cornerstone of their relationship, the thread that had held them together through every challenge. But now it felt fragile, like glass on the verge of shattering. Her eyes filled with tears as she turned away, needing a moment to gather herself. The emotions were overwhelming, anger at his audacity, fear of the unknown, and a deep, aching sadness at the possibility of losing the man she loved. But beneath it all was a flicker of curiosity, a quiet voice that asked, "What if?" She took a shaky breath and looked back at him. "Why now?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He hesitated, his expression softening. "Because I think we've reached a point where we can redefine what we mean to each other," he said. "It's not about changing us, it's about expanding what we already have." She wanted to reject his words outright, to tell him he was wrong. But there was a sincerity in his tone, a vulnerability she hadn't seen in years. The room fell silent again, the tension thick and suffocating. And yet, as she stood there, torn between anger and understanding, she realized that this wasn't just about him or her. This was about them, their love, their trust, and the fragile balance they had spent years building. Her fingers tightened around the fabric of her dress as she wrestled with the decision before her. She didn't know what the right choice was. All she knew was that whatever happened next would change everything. The decision hung in the air like an unspoken promise, heavy and inescapable. Her heart pounded as she tried to steady her breathing, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She finally met her husband's gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do this," she said, "but on my terms." His expression softened and he nodded, stepping back as if to give her the space she needed. "Of course," he replied, his tone calm but filled with an undercurrent of anticipation. It wasn't just about him anymore. This was her choice, her boundary to set. She turned to Marcus and Darnell, the two men who had waited patiently, their expressions unreadable, yet oddly reassuring. "I need you to understand something," she began, her voice trembling but resolute. "This isn't easy for me. I need to feel safe." Marcus stepped forward slightly, his movements measured and deliberate. "We understand," he said, his voice steady. "You set the pace and we'll follow. Nothing happens unless you're completely comfortable." Those words, though simple, carried an unexpected weight. They didn't erase her anxiety, but they offered a glimmer of reassurance, a sense of control in a situation that felt anything but. She took a deep breath, feeling the fabric of her dress beneath her fingers as if grounding herself in the moment. The room, though dimly lit, seemed to pulse with energy. Every sound, every flicker of light felt amplified. As the moments unfolded, her nervousness began to transform, not into confidence, but into something softer, more nuanced. She felt a strange sense of empowerment as she realized she held the reins, that her voice and her comfort dictated the course of the evening. Marcus and Darnell, true to their word, moved with an almost disarming gentleness. Their presence, while initially overwhelming, became a steadying force. Marcus cracked a quiet joke to lighten the mood, and she found herself laughing, an involuntary, almost foreign sound that momentarily broke the tension. It wasn't what she had expected, but then again, nothing about this night was. Every now and then she glanced at her husband. He stood off to the side, his eyes fixed on her, but not with jealousy or impatience. Instead, there was something deeper, admiration, perhaps even pride. It was as if he saw her in a new light, one that made her question how she had seen herself all these years. His expression was a reminder that this night wasn't about proving anything to him. It was about rediscovering parts of herself she had long ignored or forgotten. And yet, vulnerability lingered. It wasn't just the physical exposure, it was emotional, raw, and unfiltered. Every interaction, every fleeting glance peeled back a layer of her insecurities. She confronted fears she hadn't realized she carried. The fear of judgment, of losing control, of not being enough. But with every passing moment, those fears seemed to shift, morphing into something else entirely. The strangers weren't just participants in this experience, they became mirrors, reflecting parts of herself she hadn't dared to acknowledge. Their respect, their patience, and their willingness to listen made her feel seen in ways that were both exhilarating and unsettling. Her husband's voice cut through her thoughts. "You're incredible," he said softly, the words meant only for her. She blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in his tone. It was a reminder of why she had agreed to this in the first place, not for him, not even for them, but for herself. As the night progressed, she felt a shift within her. It wasn't just about the act or the circumstances. It was about what it represented. This was a moment of growth, of stepping beyond the confines of fear and expectation. And though she didn't have all the answers, she knew one thing for certain. She was stronger than she had ever realized. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, casting a golden hue over the room. She opened her eyes slowly, the events of the previous night rushing back in fragments that felt both surreal and vivid. Her husband was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. He turned to her, his expression calm, almost content, as though the night had been nothing more than a shared adventure. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm and steady. She sat up, wrapping the blanket around herself like a protective shield. "Morning," she replied, her voice tinged with hesitation. The coffee he handed her felt warm against her palms, a stark contrast to the chill of her emotions. Relief, resentment, confusion, they all swirled within her, fighting for dominance. The silence between them was thick, almost oppressive. She took a sip of the coffee, savouring its bitter comfort before finally breaking the tension. "Why?" she asked, her voice firmer than she expected. "Why did you think this was okay? To orchestrate something so massive without making sure I was truly ready?" He looked at her, his eyes earnest. "I thought I was helping you explore a part of yourself you've always kept hidden," he said. "I wanted us to experience something profound together, something that would bring us closer." She stared at him, her chest tightening. "Closer?" she repeated, incredulous. "You think trust comes from springing something like this on me? From putting me in a situation I didn't fully understand until it was too late?" His shoulders sagged slightly, a flicker of regret crossing his face. "I underestimated how you'd feel," he admitted. I thought you'd embrace it, that it would free you in ways you didn't know you needed." Her grip on the coffee cup tightened as she processed his words. Part of her wanted to lash out, to make him understand the depth of her betrayal, but another part, quieter yet insistent, recognized a sliver of truth in what he said. The experience had forced her to confront parts of herself she'd buried, vulnerabilities and strengths she hadn't known existed. "You should have asked me," she said finally, her voice trembling. "You should have given me the choice, not pushed me into it. That's not trust. That's manipulation." He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "You're right," he said. "I'm sorry, I thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now that I went about it the wrong way." The sincerity in his tone softened her anger, but it didn't erase it. Trust could be mended, but it required more than apologies. It demanded action and change. She spent the rest of the day reflecting on what had happened. The night had been a collision of emotions and experiences that left her both shaken and strangely empowered. While she resented the way it had unfolded, she couldn't deny that it had revealed aspects of herself she'd never acknowledged. That evening, as she stood in front of the mirror, she hardly recognized the woman staring back at her. There was a new depth in her eyes, a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. Her husband entered the room, his steps tentative. He stopped a few feet behind her, meeting her gaze in the mirror. "Would you do it again?" he asked, his voice careful, as if afraid of her answer. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but if there's a next time, it has to be different. It has to be on my terms, with real communication and respect." He nodded, a small, hopeful smile playing on his lips. "I can promise you that." She gave him a faint smile in return, unsure of what the future held, but determined to navigate it with the strength she now knew she possessed. And as she turned back to the mirror, she felt a flicker of hope. Whatever came next, It would be on her terms, no more, no less.